Broomfield, Colorado, December 2023. The foothills of the Rocky Mountains gleamed under a cold morning sun as 44-year-old Crystal Krug backed her SUV out of the driveway, waved goodbye to her children, and drove them to school. She was the kind of woman who filled every space she entered with life. Organized, dependable, funny in a quiet way. Friends described her as someone who remembered birthdays, someone who never forgot to send a "just checking in" text. To her co-workers and neighbors, she seemed to have the picture-perfect family, a loving husband, 3 bright children, and a cozy suburban home. But beneath the calm surface, something sinister had been tightening around her life for months. It began with messages, strange, uninvited, and unnerving. Late-night texts from an unfamiliar number, emails arriving from hidden accounts. The sender claimed to be someone from her past, an ex-boyfriend she hadn't spoken to in years. At first, the tone was conversational, almost nostalgic. Then it darkened. The words became threatening, taunting, personal in ways that made her skin crawl. She told her husband, Daniel Krug, about it, and together they agreed she should start documenting everything. She called it her stalker log. Each entry recorded time, date, content, and how the messages made her feel. Over the next weeks, the harassment intensified. The sender seemed to know where she went, when she was alone, what she was wearing. Sometimes he hinted that he could see her. Crystal confided in friends and co-workers, showing them snippets of the texts. They told her to go to the police, and she did. She filed reports, shared screenshots, and handed over her phone for tracing. Officers told her to stay alert and keep logging the messages. The idea that her ex, a man who lived hundreds of miles away, might have returned to stalk her terrified her. But what Crystal didn't know was that the monster behind those messages wasn't her ex. It was her husband. Daniel Krug, 46, was a former engineer who worked at an aerospace company. Outwardly, he was calm and polite, the neighbor who waved while mowing his lawn, the dad who coached soccer on weekends. But behind closed doors, the marriage had begun to fracture. Financial pressure, control, jealousy, the old invisible cracks that slowly widen into something dangerous. Daniel had become convinced that Crystal was pulling away from him emotionally, and instead of facing that truth, he invented a narrative that would let him play both savior and victim. He began posing as her ex-boyfriend online, creating fake email accounts, downloading messaging apps, and buying prepaid burner phones. Through those digital masks, he tormented his own wife. He sent messages threatening violence, pretending to be jealous, even claiming he was watching her from outside the house. When she showed him the texts, Daniel played the part of the protective husband, comforting her, telling her to save the evidence, even promising to install cameras around the property. The manipulation was complete. Crystal trusted him, believed they were in it together, never realizing that every moment of fear she felt was exactly what he wanted. By November 2023, the messages had become more explicit. "You can't hide," one read. "I see you." Another came late at night saying, "You don't belong to him." Crystal grew so anxious she stopped walking the dog alone. She began sleeping poorly, jumping at small noises. Her sister later told reporters that Crystal's fear was real and consuming, that she was living in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. On December 14th, 2023, that nightmare reached its end. After dropping the children at school, Crystal returned home around 8:30 a.m. Security footage from a neighbor's camera showed her pulling into the driveway and walking toward the garage. Moments later, the motion sensors that normally triggered their Ring doorbell camera went dead. The feed cut off completely. At 9:04 a.m., Daniel's phone pinged near the house, even though he was supposed to be at work. When Crystal failed to pick up her children that afternoon, Daniel called police and requested a welfare check, sounding calm and concerned. Officers arrived at the house and found the garage door closed. Inside, they discovered Crystal lying near the driver's side of her SUV, surrounded by blood. She had suffered blunt force trauma to the head and a single stab wound to the heart. The scene was staged to look like an interrupted burglary, but detectives saw through it immediately. Nothing valuable was missing, and there were no signs of forced entry. At first, the focus was on the supposed stalker. Detectives combed through Crystal's phone, finding months of disturbing messages. But when they subpoenaed data from the phone carriers and email providers, the truth began to surface. Every digital path, every IP address, login, and device signature led back to Daniel. The burner phones used to send the texts were purchased with cash, but one of them had connected to Wi-Fi at Daniel's workplace. Another had been used in the same cell tower radius as his personal phone within minutes of each other. It was the kind of mistake only arrogance could make. Investigators also discovered that on the morning of the murder, Daniel had disabled the home's security cameras and covered the Ring doorbell with black tape. Forensics showed that he'd done it deliberately. The system logs captured him logging into the account to shut down alerts. Even more chilling, several texts were sent from Crystal's phone hours after she was killed. Police later confirmed those messages were automated, scheduled in advance, likely to make it appear that she was still alive after he left the house. Within days, the case flipped entirely. The stalker wasn't real. The husband had been gaslighting his wife for months, pretending to protect her from an imaginary threat he created. It was a deception so elaborate and cruel that investigators described it as psychological torture. When Daniel was arrested, he showed no visible emotion. In interviews, he maintained his innocence, saying he loved his wife and only wanted to help her feel safe. But the mountain of digital evidence was undeniable. In April 2025, Daniel Krug went on trial at the Adams and Broomfield County Courthouse. The prosecution presented a meticulous timeline of deceit. The burner phones, the fake accounts, the IP traces, the camera logs, and Crystal's own handwritten notes, her stalker log, the very thing Daniel had encouraged her to keep, which ultimately became the evidence that condemned him. Friends and co-workers testified about her growing fear. Detectives explained how Daniel staged the entire narrative to draw suspicion away from himself. The defense argued there was no direct physical evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints tying him to the murder weapon, but the jury saw the pattern, the motive, and the sheer calculation behind it all. After 2 weeks of testimony, the verdict came swiftly. Guilty of first-degree murder, stalking, and criminal impersonation. The judge called his crime a domestic violence case taken to an extreme level of cruelty and deception. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus additional years for the related offenses. When the sentence was read, Crystal's family sat silently, holding hands. Her sister said afterward, she thought she was documenting her stalker to protect herself, but she was documenting her killer. Those words became the lasting echo of the case, a warning about how deeply manipulation can hide within the ordinary. In the months after the verdict, advocacy groups in Colorado began citing Crystal's story in domestic violence awareness campaigns, especially focusing on digital coercive control, a form of abuse that uses technology to intimidate, monitor, and deceive. Her colleagues at work planted a memorial tree near the office. Her children, now living with relatives, keep pictures of their mother smiling, holding them close, the way she always did. The house on the quiet street in Broomfield stands empty now, a silent witness to the tragedy that unfolded there. Neighbors still remember the patrol cars that lined the block, the hush that followed, the disbelief that such darkness could exist behind such a friendly door. Crystal Krug's story is not just about murder. It's about betrayal, manipulation, and the illusion of safety. She did everything victims are told to do, reported the threats, documented evidence, sought help, but no one could imagine that the person orchestrating her terror was the same man sharing her bed. Her name now stands as both a warning and a remembrance. It reminds us that danger does not always come from the shadows outside, but sometimes from the hands we hold closest. If you've been moved by Crystal's story, if her strength and her tragedy touched you, don't let her voice fade. Share her story, talk about her name, and help others recognize the hidden patterns of control that too often end in silence. If you're new to the channel, hit like, share this video to keep her story alive, and subscribe for more real true crime stories. Stories of justice, heartbreak, and the fight to make sure no one else has to live in fear.